Greetings, I'm Michael Quinn Patton. This video is a review of and response to an important article by distinguished systems thinker Michael C. Jackson of the University of Hull. In this article, he presents critical systems practice as a model for evaluating programs and critiques the way in which systems concepts are currently widely used in evaluation. I've been doing evaluation for more than 50 years and have written several books about evaluation and use those systems concepts. And so this article provides me an opportunity to reflect on how we are using systems concepts and to consider Professor Jackson's critique. Now, ordinarily, in the scholarly world, I would publish such a critique. But publication these days takes a long time, and this deserves a rapid response. And so I've turned to the video format as a way of responding more quickly to this important article. It turns out that I have a lot to say about the article. Indeed, my full response is more than an hour in length. And so think of this opening as an executive summary or an abstract in which I'll cover the high points and then turn to the full critique for those who want to get into the weeds, the systems thinkers who are deeply committed to engaging with these issues can look at the details. So here's a brief overview of Professor Jackson's key points and my responses. We're going to be looking at how systems concepts compare to critical systems practice as useful evaluation frameworks. The critical systems practice is a perspective that consists of machine lens, an organism lens, cultural political lens, societal environmental lens, and interrelationship lens. The systems concepts are understanding interrelationships, engaging with perspectives, and reflecting on boundaries. Professor Jackson begins by saying that the systems concepts are of, quote, limited use, close quote. But use is not a matter of opinion. It's an empirical question. And so I will document the ways in which evaluators are actually using systems concepts and using them often as part of a larger framework, like utilization-focused evaluation, culturally responsive evaluation. Professor Jackson says that the systems concepts are without theoretical substance. I'll review the way in which those concepts emerged as grounded theory. First, where systems thinkers and evaluators got together and looked across different systems approaches to identify those core dimensions and elements that cut across the many different systems frameworks, and identified those three systems concepts as the signals that cut through all the noise of diversity and competing perspectives. I'll then review how the American Evaluation Association topical interest group of systems evaluators took those systems concepts, worked with them, and converted them into systems evaluation principles. I'll basically make the case that having knowledgeable and experienced systems thinkers and evaluators identify core concepts, work with those in evaluation practice, and convert them into principles constitutes essentially solid, grounded theory and makes for a substantial theoretical foundation for those concepts. The third point is that Professor Jackson believes the systems concepts are, quote, philosophically untenable. Based upon the emphasis on use of the systems concepts and the pragmatic position that what is useful is true, I'm going to argue that the philosophy of pragmatism undergirds the utility and meaningfulness and philosophical position of the systems concepts. He also argues that the concepts are flawed and confusing. I shall argue in contrast that looking at them as thick, sensitizing concepts that are understandable and accessible makes them quite far from flawed and confusing, actually a point of entree for ordinary people into systems thinking. The notion that these concepts have to be positioned with historically distinct systems approaches is not, from my position as a utilization-focused evaluator, a tenable position. Rather, part of the value of the terms interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries is that ordinary people can understand them. And it is the height of academic arrogance to believe that you have to have a paradigm perspective on these terms in order to use them. Ordinary people understand what these concepts mean and can engage with them to take an evaluation deeper and enhance its utility. The fifth and final point I'll cover in point counterpoint is Professor Jackson believes that critical systems thinking approach is preferred as best. In contrast, I will argue that there is no best way to do an evaluation, that contingency theory, bricolage, and contextual adaptation inform evaluation practice, that systems concepts are often embedded within larger evaluation frameworks like utilization-focused evaluation and culturally sensitive evaluation, and that the ways in which the concepts help go deeper in overall evaluation questions is a matter of situational adaptation, and that the framework offered by critical systems practice is too narrow and prescriptive to suit the variety of situations that evaluators face in the real world. I then turn to a critique of critical systems practice from a utilization-focused evaluation perspective. First, critical systems practice, I think, fails to incorporate what we have learned about making evaluations useful over the last 50 years. And we've learned a great deal. This has been a major focus of research on evaluation, including attention to what we call process use, the ways in which people engaged in evaluation learn to think systemically and evaluatively as being a part of and experiencing evaluation. Second, critical systems practice, in my judgment, legitimizes linear reductionist machine thinking by including the machine lens as a systems perspective. In fact, what we're engaged in with evaluation is trying to move people away from the domination of linear machine thinking to systems thinking, and to legitimate machine linear thinking within a systems framework does damage to the very effort we're making to embed more systems thinking, more systematic critical thinking into evaluation. A third problem related is that the four-stage critical systems practice model is itself mechanistic sequential thinking. The four key epic stages of critical systems practice, explore, produce, intervene, and check, each of which Professor Jackson has written a major article about, treats these as a mechanistic sequential sequence, when in fact from a complex dynamic systems perspective, these processes are ongoing, integrated, overlapping, mutually reinforcing, and iterative. Exploration, producing a strategy, design, intervention, evaluation are ongoing, integrated processes, not separate stages in a complex dynamic world. And that will bring us to considering the integration principle of blue marble evaluation. The fourth critique of critical systems practice is that it does not adequately address systems transformation in the context of the polycrisis. The polycrisis being the interlocking, interactive, interdependent, mutually reinforcing, and iterative crises of the climate emergency, pandemic, growing inequality, massive refugees, and misinformation on social media. The call for our times is all hands on deck for systems transformation. Critical systems practice, as I see it conceptualized by Professor Jackson, is helping solve concrete systems problems, but is not addressing massive systems transformation. And I'll take on that difference in that critique in the final part of this video. So that's the overview of my response to Professor Jackson's critique of how evaluators are using systems concepts. In the remainder of this video, I'll go into these points in greater depth, explore their implications, and offer a different kind of perspective on how evaluators are using systems concepts appropriately and usefully. So we'll be comparing and contrasting systems concepts as currently used in evaluation with critical systems practice and comparing them as useful evaluation frameworks. Professor Michael Jackson is former president of the UK Systems Society, of the International Federation for Systems Research, and the International Society for Systems Sciences. He is the former editor-in-chief of Systems Research and Behavior Science, in which this article appeared, and is a distinguished author. Having published a number of books, including recently Systems Thinking, Creative Holism for Managers, and Critical Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity. He says in the introduction of his article that critical systems practice seeks to assist decision makers and other stakeholders achieve improvements in the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world in which they operate, and to manage the wicked problems they face. He goes on to say, I invite comment on what I have got right and wrong, and what more needs doing. I appreciate that invitation, and hereby take it up. In the article, he identifies 5 systemic perspectives that he believes have demonstrated a capacity to provide significant insight into complex problem situations: machine, organism, cultural, political, societal, environmental, and interrelationships. We'll return to examine these in more detail shortly, but let me first compare them to the systems concepts that Professor Jackson is criticizing. Bob Williams, a systems thinker and evaluator, has said, over the systems field's nearly 100 years of life, there have been many attempts to identify what all these aspects of the field have in common. In recent years, a loose consensus has formed around these components: understanding interrelationships, acknowledging multiple perspectives, making and reflecting on boundary choices, and most importantly, Bob adds, integrating these 3 concepts to enable systemic thinking and systemic practice. And that's what Bob has done and offered to evaluation as a major systems approach. That is what is being criticized as the systems concepts framework in Professor Jackson's paper. He says, a popular mode of introducing systemic evaluation, making use of key systems concepts, interrelationships, multiple perspectives, boundaries, etc., has merit as a means of gaining acceptance for systems ideas among funders and clients who might otherwise prove resistant. But ultimately, however, he says, the approach is, quote, philosophically untenable, and in initially seeking to simplify matters, leads to more confusion in the long run. He then goes to recommend that critical systems thinking is the preferred approach as developed at the University of Hull. So, in summary, he's saying systems concept approach to evaluation is philosophically untenable, leads to confusion, and the critical systems approach or critical systems practice is to be preferred and replace the systems concepts. Professor Jackson then goes on to assert that the systems concepts approach, quote, is so flawed, close quote, because the concepts have become context-free abstractions that have lost connection with their roots in different systems methodologies. Quote, it, that is, the systems concepts approach, fails to recognize how damaging this is for the approach it recommends and how confusing it will inevitably prove for those who wish to follow its recommendations. Strong condemnation indeed. Professor Jackson concludes that systems concepts are, quote, of limited use, close quote, for evaluation. Well, that certainly got my attention, inasmuch as I've spent 50 plus years as a professional evaluator, dependent on making sure that my evaluations are useful because that's how I make my living. I also have studied use, written about use. In the new edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation, which has just appeared, we include attention to how to use systems concepts and complexity understandings to enhance the use of evaluations. So Professor Jackson's insistence that systems concepts are, quote, of limited use, close quote, especially deserves rebuttal, which I propose to now undertake. The key point being that you, as a viewer, will have an opportunity to weigh the evidence and consider the arguments to decide what is most appropriate for your own evaluation practice and systemic inquiry, whatever that may be. But in order to consider these two approaches, we're going to need some criteria to judge their merit and worth. And I propose that we look at how each approach supports real-world evaluation practice, that we look at utility, usefulness and actual use, that we look at credibility. Professor Jackson is highly critical of the systems concepts as being philosophically untenable and theoretically without important grounding. The political viability of the two approaches and the transformative power of these approaches for both evaluation and for transforming systems. Let's begin with the practice of critical systems practice called EPIC. 4 stages, beginning with exploring the problem situation, then producing an intervention strategy, intervening flexibly, and checking on progress, which is where the evaluation piece comes in. Professor Jackson has written an article about each of these stages, and the article to which I'm responding is the 4th, on checking on progress. Evaluate the improvements achieved, reflect on the systems approaches used, discuss and agree on next steps. These stages take different forms with different terminology and different systems and different evaluation approaches, but they represent a common kind of sequence. This one is labeled EPIC: explore, produce, intervene, and check. In what this emphasizes when we're talking about real-world evaluation practice is that whatever approach is used, critical systems practice, systems concepts, is part of a larger process. It's not just an isolated approach by itself, but systems approaches are part of a larger process, especially in evaluation. And so their meaningfulness, their value is going to depend upon what that larger evaluation process is. For me, that is utilization-focused evaluation, meaning that intended use by intended users is the guiding mantra of utilization-focused evaluation, the guiding principle to know who the intended users are for an evaluation and what their intended use is. And that requires knowing what their capacity is, what questions they're asking, what kind of evaluation they're looking to do, what the methodological options are. And systems concepts is a part of that overall framing, but is not a standalone approach. It's not something you just do the 3 systems concepts. They are part of a larger facilitation process, and they require facilitation, as does the entire evaluation process when it's utilization focused. And so real-world evaluation practice would place these approaches in this larger context. I've done a YouTube video identifying over 101 evaluation approaches. I stopped counting at 101, but there are more. And so systems concepts don't stand alone as an evaluation approach, but are typically integrated into other approaches. Here are some examples. In an article on culturally responsive evaluation meets systems-oriented evaluation, Veronica Thomas and Beverly Parsons explored the ways in which these approaches bring different strengths that can be combined for a more comprehensive evaluation. At the American Evaluation Association Annual Conference in November 2022, a number of such integrated approaches were presented, including systems-informed empowerment evaluation. Another session looked at an integrated complexity systems analysis framework for the evaluation of complex development programs. Still another looked at the application of what they called a 5R framework in an evaluation, which involves a systems framework that includes roles, relationships, rules, resources, and results integrated systemically. Still another session, evaluation of complex organizational structures in a clinical and translational science awards program, from a systematic framework to a visualization dashboard. Mapping distinctions in the implementation of a learning system, which include systems thinking and systemic learning as frameworks for evaluation. Complexity in systems in evaluation of innovation. The prestigious National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago has evaluators working on an equitable systems change evaluation framework. Former American Evaluation Association President Beverly Parsons has been doing work on ecology-based systems and living systems grounded in principles of interdependence, symbiosis and partnering, resilience through flexibility and diversity. In 2021, a special issue of New Directions for Evaluation was devoted to systems and complexity-informed evaluation, Insights from Practice, edited by Emily Gates, Matt Walton, and Pablo Vidriera. The volume documents the diversity of approaches to systems thinking that is being applied and used in evaluation, which means that contingency theory reigns. Situational, contextual, and evaluator matching, what makes sense for a particular evaluation, is what's going to determine what the approach is. And that means that there would be approaches where critical systems practice might well be most appropriate, and at times and situations where systems concepts are particularly compelling. And yet the article opens by Professor Jackson saying, the aim is to set out where thinking has reached on the best way to carry out evaluating. Well, I've concluded over my 50 years that there are no best practices. There is no one best way of going about doing really anything, including evaluation. There are a lot of bad ways. There are a lot of really bad ways. There are a lot of really bad ways. And there are good ways, better ways, but no best ways. Think about what would have to happen for something to merit the label best. All possibilities would have to be identified and compared to each other. Clearly, that hasn't happened in evaluation or in systems. And to say that something is best means that context doesn't matter, that it applies universally, regardless of situation. And that is an absurd claim. And so this notion that something is best is really quite unfortunate. And so that search and that assertion is empty from my perspective, and in fact quite dangerous, leading to claims that can't be substantiated, as is the case here. Real-world evaluation, then, working under budget, time, data, and political constraints, means that we have to make choices about what's possible. The critical systems practice involves a comprehensive approach to evaluation, an ideal approach with depth and comprehensiveness, but the real world requires boundary choices about how much can be done, and that's a constraint. Jackson acknowledges that the systems concept approach has gained the most traction in the evaluation community, and in so acknowledging, I think it's worth asking, perhaps, just perhaps, it's worth asking, why? And I think part of it is that it is being incorporated as a bricolage practice with other evaluation approaches, adding a systems understanding to whatever the larger evaluation questions and process is. But it's also being widely used in evaluation because of its utility, its usefulness, and actual use. And that's what I want to turn to next. The Minnesota Humanities Center in 2015 undertook a strategic planning process in which they added systems and systems change to their overall strategic framework. In so doing, they began to think about how to do systems evaluation. This was heightened when George Floyd in 2020 was murdered by a white police officer in Minnesota, where I'm coming to you from. And so the Minnesota Humanities Center, as a part of the uprising that came out of that murder, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the United States, and indeed the Black Lives Matter and social justice uprising that spread around the world, brought attention to systemic and structural racism. And the evaluation work that the Minnesota Humanities Center began doing incorporated systems concepts as a way of dealing with systemic and structural racism. The work with the Minnesota Humanities Center involved what we also call process use. That is, beyond engaging around findings, it also means building the capacity to think evaluatively and to think systemically, so that our work with the Minnesota Humanities Center helped incorporate how to use attention to interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries as a way of designing interventions, of implementing the work, of evaluating the work, of making systems thinking meaningful and ongoing. Process use has to do with the things that an organization and the people involved in evaluation learn as a part of engaging in the evaluation. It's using the process to deepen understanding, to generate shared understandings about how to make evaluation a part of doing business, make it part of the ongoing learning and strategy processes. And the Minnesota Humanities Center made learning to think systemically and with systems concepts a part of their approach to evaluation, with important implications for dealing with systemic and structural racism. The World Food Program in 2021 undertook a retrospective developmental evaluation of the organization's response to COVID. They used developmental evaluation as a way of identifying key transition and adaptation moments, places where the organization had to pivot. The resulting report included attention to systems concepts by looking at the interrelationships of the World Food Programs with other humanitarian efforts, at looking at how the parts within the World Food Program, the different units were interrelated, what their perspectives were about the pandemic, and using the subsystems of the World Food Program to draw boundaries around the scope of the evaluation. The evaluation then looked at what was maintained during the COVID, what was pivoted, what was expanded, what was innovated, and anything that was stopped. And systems concepts helped inform this analysis. Another example is the work of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. This is an alliance of some 30 philanthropic foundations from 4 continents working on the vision you see in the bottom left-hand corner of a healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, and culturally diverse food and agriculture systems shaped by people, communities, and their institutions. The Global Alliance Executive Director, Ruth Richardson, has emphasized how systems concepts and evaluation using those concepts have helped them navigate their way through the complexities they faced. Quote, "It enables us to create deep and meaningful interconnections to avoid the trap of limited silver bullet solutions that bring about unintended consequences, and ultimately to disrupt the status quo that jeopardizes the future of food." In a special issue of New Directions for Evaluation, entitled Systems and Complexity Informed Evaluation, Insights from Practice, Ruth Richardson and I wrote about Leadership Evaluation Partnership, subtitled Infusing Systems Principles and Complexity Concepts for a Transformational Alliance. In that journal, she writes, "The Global Alliance for the Future of Food provides a case exemplar of incorporating systems thinking, complexity understandings, and developmental evaluation into systems transformation work. This transformational engagement is not just rhetoric, but is deeply embedded as the focus of the Global Alliance's ongoing work. It is, importantly, predicated on in-depth and long-term co-creation and collaboration between Alliance leadership and an independent external evaluator." This chapter we wrote together tells the story of how the Global Alliance incorporated systems thinking, complexity understandings, and principles-focused developmental evaluation into systems transformation work. Still another example of the use of systems concepts for evaluation came in our work with the United Nations Food Systems Summit in 2021, where more than 1,000 dialogues took place around the world in preparation for the summit. And as part of our Blue Marble evaluation team, we synthesized those dialogues. That synthesis and the resulting reports were based upon incorporating interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries into helping to make sense of the results of the dialogue. In the report, we stated, "The Food Systems Summit has elevated and focused attention on food systems. The language and rhetoric of systems is noticeably ascendant. Thinking systemically is still nascent." In other words, we found that the dialogues around the world engaging in questions about food systems gave people a greater sense that taking a systemic approach would be important, but their understanding of how to do that is going to require a great deal more work and capacity building. This was a similar conclusion that Bob Williams reached in taking a deep dive into those dialogues that specifically had the language of systems in their title or in their abstract. And he likewise concluded that while they did a good job on the whole of thinking about interrelationships and perspectives, they were weaker on understanding the implications of how and where to draw boundaries. I've gone over these examples quickly, simply to illustrate that using systems concepts has become integral to my utilization-focused evaluation practice, and especially developmental evaluation, as well as work with a variety of both local, national, and international agencies to build their capacity to think both evaluatively and systemically. And that work continues, and I'm suggesting proves useful. Which brings us now to Professor Jackson's critique of systems concepts approach as, quote, philosophically untenable, close quote. I take exception to that conclusion. I've been emphasizing the utility, use, and usefulness of utilization-focused evaluation and systems concepts as a part of that practice because it's based in pragmatism, the philosophy of pragmatism, in which truth emerges and is understood in the context of use. Truth is confirmed and verified by experience, what Dewey called, quote, warranted assertability, close quote, connecting utility with verifiability of truth. It can also be thought of as a manifestation of Aristotle's practical wisdom. In essence, what is useful is true in both a theoretical and practical sense. Seville Kushner, in a new book, says, quote, pragmatism is mostly an American invention. European philosophy has tended toward abstractions, looking for first principles and watertight arguments. The pragmatists, on the other hand, have been solely concerned with the world of action and consequences, practical ethics, and political feasibility. I am a pragmatist. The system's concept's use is pragmatic and is philosophically tenable in that sense. But there are critiques of pragmatism, especially that false ideas can have utility and still be false. So utility alone is inadequate as a basis for determining truth. And this seems to be a part of what Professor Jackson is arguing when he says that the systems concepts are an inadequate basis for engaging deeply and comprehensively in systems thinking. So let's examine the basis for those concepts as a matter of their credibility. And for that, let's see what Professor Jackson is asking. He says, what is the justification for these particular systems, by which he means systems concepts? Quote, Williams tells us that the original three concepts emerged after 3 days of deliberation between systems and evaluation experts in a room at Berkeley. The only actual theoretical justification seems to be a tenuous link between the three concepts and Midgley's idea that there have been 3 successive waves of thinking about systems. It turns out there is more to the story than that. These 3 concepts and the results of that meeting were published in an anthology by Bob Williams and Iraq Imam in 2007. And in that book, they describe how these patterns about perspectives, boundaries, and entangled systems as core concepts emerged. They said, let me read it to you. So for those of you looking for coherence about what we consider to be relevant systems concepts for evaluation, our advice is to look for patterns rather than definitions. And these were the patterns that they identified. These 3 concepts are essential both for understanding systems-based interventions and for distinguishing them from other approaches to complex situations. They underpin the models, metaphors, methodologies, and methods used by the systems field. They provide the key to unlock the potential benefits of systems approaches to evaluation. Where does that assertion come from? Well, these people who represented the systems field and the evaluation field began in that 3-day convening by sharing their own backgrounds and perspectives, and then together looking for commonalities. What were the core ideas that ran across their different experiences and conceptualizations? Among the participants were 2 future presidents of the American Evaluation Association and a future president of the International Society for the Systems Sciences. It was a distinguished and experienced group. Through their engagement, they reviewed the various approaches to the systems field, including Professor Jackson's critical systems work and others. And out of that comparison, and out of their analysis and experiences, they settled on these 3 systems concepts. This is a form of grounded theory, where key people are brought together to consider what their work has in common, to generate core concepts out of a lot of possibilities, and indeed to settle on what are the important things that are the signals that cut through the noise. The many different systems approaches, the many different evaluation approaches are the noise. And the system that emerged is the signal. These three concepts, where entangled systems ultimately became interrelationships. This grounded theory process then involves people looking at how to think about or code what they have in common, going back and verifying that by looking at what it captures, reiterating the meaningfulness and potential utility of those categories, and then finding the language to label them so they can communicate it as, in fact, a form of theory, of grounded theory. And that is where Bob Williams' conclusion that opened this video came from, where he says, and it's worth repeating, over the systems field's nearly 100 years of life, there have been many attempts to identify what all these aspects of the field have in common. In recent years, a loose consensus has formed around these components: understanding interrelationships, acknowledging multiple perspectives, making and reflecting on boundary choices, and most importantly, integrating these concepts to enable systemic thinking and systemic practice. This work has led to what Bob now calls a sensitizing framework for both interventions and evaluation, understanding interrelationships of both interventions and evaluations, engaging with perspectives, and reflecting on boundaries of both the intervention and the evaluation. And for this work, nearly 10 years after the publication of the anthology, Bob Williams was awarded the American Evaluation Association's highest award, the Paul Lazarsfeld Theory Award. And in that interim period, a great many evaluators, as I've documented, had began using the systems concepts in their work. And Bob has pursued this work in his own publications. Gerald Medgley makes a conceptualization of these different systems approaches based upon his own understanding and knowledge of the systems field, where he looks at how the emphases of different systems approaches can be thought of as manifesting in boundaries, relationships, perspectives, and overall systems concepts, approaches for developing viable and highly responsive organizational systems at multiple levels. Another arena of validation, or what do we call warranted assertion. And yet the story doesn't finish there. For after Bob Williams won the Lazarsfeld Award, the American Evaluation Association Systems and Evaluation Topical Interest Group, an affinity group of evaluators interested in systems, formed a task force to look at how to turn the concepts of systems into principles for effective use of systems thinking in evaluation. But I want to call attention to it because it's an important evolution of the systems concepts, from concepts into principles, and adding to interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries a fourth principle, dynamics. The preamble to that document says, the primary purpose of these principles is to support evaluators and evaluation stakeholders in the use of systems concepts in evaluation. This preamble provides some high-level definitions and general guidance to inform the use of these principles in evaluation. So 21 systems evaluators worked over 2 years to use the guide framework of principles-focused evaluation to convert the concepts into principles. The guide framework calls for principles to provide guidance, be useful, be inspiring, be developmental, which means adaptable, and be evaluatable. Concepts capture and express knowledge. Values are beliefs about what matters, and principles provide behavioral guidance. So while Professor Jackson notes that the Systems and Evaluation Topical Interest Group validated the concepts, he hasn't noted the movement to principles, which I think gives more behavioral emphasis and application understandings to these concepts, makes them operational, makes them behavioral. And that's not a small step for practicing evaluators. So let me summarize this journey and development. In 2007, experienced and knowledgeable evaluators and systems thinkers came together and identified cross-cutting patterns across different systems approaches. Those became concepts that turned into principles in 2018 with the American Evaluation Association group. Thus, over a period of 15 years, up to the present, these ideas, first observed as patterns, turned into concepts, and evolved into principles, have proved useful, valid, and meaningful for practicing evaluators. Not a small thing, and not something to turn away from or abandon lightly. Professor Jackson does acknowledge the Systems and Evaluation Topical Interest Group work and is critical of it. So it's worth spending just a little bit more time on that criticism. He says, the fact that the meaning of concepts such as interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries is contested, that is, that they are interpreted differently in different systems traditions, gets to the heart of the main criticism of the systems concepts approach. The Systems Evaluation TIG document acknowledges the problem. The principles presented here, this is a quote from the document, will inevitably be interpreted differently when understood using different definitions of the core concepts. He writes, but it fails to recognize how damaging this is for the approach it recommends and how confusing it will inevitably prove for those who wish to follow its recommendations. It concludes weakly that, quote, SETIC members may wish to revisit this issue after further study and discussion. Miller recognizes that the problem is far more serious. Quote, yes, there are broad shared similarities among various schools of systems thought, as Patton notes, but at the razor's edge of practice, the differences in concepts, methods, and practice can be stark. Systems thinking offers ways to learn in the context of unknowable futures, but not through mere use of its concepts alone. As J. Wright Forrester, the founder of Systems Dynamics, wisely observed in a 1992 interview, it is not enough to engage in an undisciplined use of select system concepts, for example, boundaries, perspectives, and relationships, if the goal is to understand complex problems and engage in innovative social problem solving. What I take as the essence of this critique is that because systems concepts have different meanings in different systems traditions, that they fail to provide consistency needed for in-depth comprehensive analysis systemically, and that therefore the systems concepts fail both in terms of a consistency criterion and a depth of systems thinking criterion. These criticisms of systems concepts in evaluation are serious enough that they deserve in-depth response, which I propose to make in 5 key points. First, has already been done. I've made the case that the concepts are useful with evidence from practicing evaluators, that the concepts are philosophically based in pragmatism and theoretically grounded through grounded theory. But I shall also then argue in support of the utility and meaningfulness of the concepts that they are contextually adaptable, that they constitute sensitizing concepts, and that gives them particular usefulness, that they provide minimum specifications for systems evaluation. Having already covered the first point, I turn again to the systems and complexity-informed evaluation issue of new directions for evaluation to take up the second point about contextually adaptable concepts. In the Systems and Complexity-Informed Evaluation issue of New Directions for Evaluation, the editors note in their opening chapter, quote, evaluators promoting and conducting systems and complexity-informed evaluations draw on different aspects of these traditions, use variations of these in other terms, and apply them to issues and features of evaluation practice. This means that there is not one theory or way of practicing evaluation. Moreover, trends continue to change, leading to continual variation. In other words, that's how the world is. There are lots of frameworks, there are lots of perspectives, there are lots of terminology, there are lots of concepts, and they have to be defined and given meaning in context. There are no major, universal, generic definitions for important terms in the disciplines. They are always matters of dispute and have to be defined contextually. This includes the term evaluation, about which there is no uniform or agreed upon definition, or the word systems, about which there is no uniform or agreed definition of. Experienced, knowledgeable, savvy practitioners know that terms have to be defined contextually. The diversity of frameworks is not an issue, it's a menu. It's a panorama of possibility. Evaluator matching. Rather than suggesting, as Dr. Jackson does, that we replace concepts with critical systems practice, the way the field develops is that multiple approaches emerge to solve particular problems. They have a special niche. They deal with particular issues. And the challenge is one of situational, contextual, and evaluator matching. Our responsibility is to point out the strengths and contributions of each approach, the weaknesses of those approaches, and to help people make decisions about what's appropriate for a given evaluation challenge and situation. This also means that these are not operational, uniform, generic, generalizable concepts, but are sensitizing concepts. Sensitizing concepts means they are concepts that tell us what to look for. They're a basket of possibilities, and they call our attention to something important. That's what makes them theoretical concepts as sensitizing concepts. They say this is an important idea. It gives us direction about something to pay attention to, and then we have to give its meaning within a particular context. Philosopher Elizabeth Minnick worked with Hannah Arendt on, quote, illuminating insights, ideas that ask to be brought into conversation, close quote. Trying to narrowly and operationally define such illuminating ideas leads to conceptual errors, what Hannah Arendt called, more dramatically, metaphysical fallacies. Trying to operationalize sensitizing concepts is such a conceptual error. I like the gravitas of metaphysical fallacy. Sensitizing concepts constitute illuminating insights about something that deserves attention and, to be sure, conversation. But such conversations and dialogues are not expected to yield operational definitions or universal ones. Instead, they yield conceptual insights that are illuminative about manifestations of situational diversity and complexity. That's the real world. I did a book with Elizabeth Minnick called Thought Work, Thinking, Action, and the Fate of the World, where we looked at the importance of bringing critical thinking to concepts so that they can be made sense of within different uses and contexts. A related term are thick concepts. Williams introduced the phrase thick concepts in a 1985 book on ethics and the limitation of philosophy. This was a takeoff on the anthropologist Geertz's notion of thick description. In Williams' terms, thick concepts are both action guiding and guided by the world. They are action guiding in that they are typically indicate the presence of reasons for action, and they are world guided in that their correct application depends on how the world is. Without explicitly designating the terms as sensitizing, illuminating, and or thick, evaluators commonly use concepts that exhibit these characteristics to inform their understanding of what to pay attention to, and the resulting mindfulness is both descriptive, what is happening, and prescriptive, that is evaluative, guiding what to do. Consider the notion of context itself, which King and Alkin emphasize as critical to understand use and influence. Any particular evaluation is designed within some context, and we are admonished to take context into account, be sensitive to context. But there's not agreement about a universal operational definition of context. These are language things that come out of our conversation and dialogue. So, what does Dr. Jackson say about context in his article? He writes, ultimately, the systems concepts approach relies on the belief that the terms we use, interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries, have a context-free meaning grounded by features of the world. Well, I know of no one using these concepts who think that they have context-free meanings. They are grounded by features of the world, but that is where context is, in the world. He goes on to say, there is no context-free meaning of the terms, with which I agree, such as interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries. Different systems methodologies use them in radically different ways. As a consequence, it is always necessary to relate systems concepts back to particular systemic perspectives in order to understand their meaning and grasp their usefulness. As Pepper has it, quote, concepts which have lost contact with their root metaphors are empty abstractions. This is essentially why the systems concepts approach, along with DSRP, its recent ally, is so flawed. No, I don't agree that you have to have the grounding of these terms in their historical intellectual development. If you're working within a particular systems tradition, then you need to know how that tradition used it. But these are words that have ordinary meaning to them. This notion that you have to immerse these terms in particular intellectual traditions ignores the fact that these terms are not jargon academic terms. They are part of our language. People know what interrelationships are, what perspectives are, what boundaries are. We use these terms in ordinary conversation with ordinary people. It's part of the reason I like these systems concepts, is that they are terms that ordinary people can make sense of in their context, in their culture, and we don't have to say, oh, but it means this if you're doing critical systems, and it means this if you're doing a particular heuristics or soft methods or something else. These are words that people can access, and we give them meaning within the context where they are used. It is a kind of academic arrogance, it seems to me, to say, oh, we academics have special definitions and meanings of these terms, and unless you really know what they are and have studied their intellectual history, you can't use them appropriately. No, that's insulting to ordinary people. They can make sense of what interrelationships are. They can make sense of what it means to look at diverse perspectives. They understand where you draw boundaries around things and the implications of that. Let me offer another reason why I like the systems concepts and find them useful. It's because they can be thought of as min-specs, minimum specifications. Min-specs establish only those very few requirements necessary to define something, leaving everything else open to the creative evolution of the complex adaptive system. In the latest edition of the Utilization-Focused Evaluation book, we've taken a min-specs approach. Core elements that identify what is essential, that is, what is the minimum that must occur for an evaluation to be considered utilization-focused. That means that it is intended use by intended users. At a minimum, you have to know who an evaluation is for and how it's going to be used or intended to be used to do utilization-focused evaluation. Min-specs applied to systems concepts means that at a minimum, you have to be able to look at interrelationships, identify multiple and diverse perspectives, know where the boundaries are being drawn, and pay attention to dynamics. Min-specs are a powerful way to make a framework and approach accessible. And that's what I think the systems concepts have done so well for evaluation. In my developmental evaluation principles, systems thinking is one of the principles, and the min-specs of interrelationships, perspectives, boundaries, and dynamics are the access to the min-specs for what it means to do systems thinking. And so these core systems concepts can be thought of as min-specs, and I treat them in that way when I'm working with people around an evaluation. It's not the whole package. It's well advised, as Dr. Jackson admonishes, to go more deeply into systems understanding. That this is not the whole package, but it is an important way to make it accessible to people. And it involves in what one of our pioneers, Peter Rossi, also the author of the major textbook used in evaluation, called good enough evaluation. He evokes the notion of satisficing. To satisfice is to satisfy and suffice, in a term created by Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate in 1978, who created in 1956 this term satisficing, to say a quick, easy decision that, while not a result of reviewing all options perfectly, is good enough. Gert Geigerenzer, a psychologist and director emeritus of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, has a new book out called How to Stay Smart in a Smart World, which celebrates rules of thumb heuristics and what he calls the priority rule. Know what is most important. Well, what is most important is another version of min-specs. Rules of thumb are the things that cut through all the complexity that provide you guidance in complex dynamic situations. And he celebrates the ways in which rules of thumb, heuristics in decision making, the priority rule, min-specs allow us to satisfice and have good enough evaluations. Joseph Stiglitz, another Nobel laureate, says rules of thumb aren't just satisfactory, they're effective. In an article he published with others economists, he said, quote, our results suggest that fast and frugal, robust heuristics may not be a second best option, but rather rational responses in complex and changing macroeconomic environments. In other words, we need conceptual guidance to manage the complexities that we face and to make those complexities something that we can deal with and navigate. Our battle is against simple linear reductionist thinking, not competition among different systems perspectives. In the New Directions volume I talked about, edited by Emily Gates, Matt Walton, and Pablo Viduria, they get into the importance for many in the global evaluation communities calling for shifts from linear reductionist ways of thinking and working to approaches that embrace systems and complexity. That's the basis of the volume that they pulled together. And so moving from project and program thinking to systems transformation interventions and evaluation using systemic inquiry is where the real action is. And trying to say that one systems approach is inherently better than another for evaluation strikes me as not helpful in this regard. Different systems approaches do different things. They offer different kinds of insights. Each is developed to address a particular kind of challenge. But cutting across those different approaches as core concepts is a way to engage the battle against simple reductionist linear thinking, and to say that by addressing interrelationships, multiple perspectives, engaging around boundaries and dynamics. We're moving the field towards more systemic inquiry. Critical systems practice argues that, quote, rich appreciation of complex problem situations can be achieved by making use of the lenses provided by some well-tested and clearly formulated systemic perspective. So the 5 systemic perspectives that have, quote, demonstrated a capacity to provide significant insight into complex problem situations, close quote, are machine, organism, cultural political, societal environmental, and interrelationships. And among these then, at the top is the machine orientation. This reifies linear reductionist thinking to a systems perspective, the very thing we're attempting to move the field away from as a systems perspective is here presented as a core systems perspective. And I find that quite problematic, and indeed offer that I can well imagine that evaluators and commissioners of evaluation wanting to hang on to the machine perspective, the linear reductionist project and program perspective in their work, will point to this as justification for so doing. So taking up Dr. Jackson's invitation to suggest ways of improving the critical systems practice, let me turn to the 4 key stages of critical systems practice with which we began and which he features in his article. And what I would say about these is that the very notion of treating these kind of process as a set of discrete steps, as stages, is not in keeping with our current understandings of complex dynamic systems. Stage approaches are fairly outdated at this stage. And these issues of exploring the problem, producing an intervention strategy, intervening, checking on progress, I now see these things as interrelated. The stage theory is mechanistic sequential thinking, but in reality, the integration principle of blue marble evaluation is to see that design, needs assessment, situation analysis, implementation, evaluation are ongoing integrated processes. They can't be separated into steps or stages. In the new edition of utilization-focused evaluation, the new 5th edition that came out this year, we got rid of the steps. We don't treat it as a stepwise process anymore. The principles of utilization-focused evaluation run throughout an evaluation from beginning to end. And the concepts inform work throughout an evaluation from beginning to end. And so this whole notion of following a set of steps instead of seeing it as an integrated, fluid, whole process that incorporates fundamental concepts throughout is, in my mind, one of the weaknesses of the current conceptualization of critical systems practice. And I would invite Dr. Jackson and colleagues to rethink the mechanistic nature of their stages. Evaluation is now focused on evaluating the transformation of systems. As transformation has become the clarion call of our time, dealing with the issues that are societal and environmental, cultural and political, we are in a global emergency, a polycrisis of the climate emergency, equity justice issues, nuclear threat, infodemic of disinformation, economic and financial turbulence, a pandemic, and other factors that are threatening the future of humanity. We need everyone's best thinking, everyone engaged in ways that help us understand systems dynamics, systems transformation, and using systems understandings and dynamics as ways to help bring about the transformation of systems that will ensure that the future is more sustainable and equitable. Integrating humans and nature, taking a whole earth perspective, these are the challenges of systems thinking going forward. And as we connect our networks together globally, I want to thank Michael Jackson for his invitation to review his article and to comment upon critical systems practice. It has been helpful for me to think about the value of systems concepts and why I find them useful. I certainly welcome comments and responses from anyone who's viewed this video, especially Dr. Jackson and his colleagues. We all need to bring our best thinking to bear in the face of the challenges of the polycrisis. As for me, I've become convinced that systems concepts and complexity understandings will help evaluation contribute more significantly to the kind of systems transformations needed for a more sustainable and equitable world.